What if I told you the first American tech giants didn't write code, didn't pitch VCs, and never once tweeted, but they still controlled your information, your energy, and your time more completely than any app on your phone? Long before Silicon Valley, a handful of men turned wires, light, and sound into empires. And you're still living in the world they built. Picture a room, not a clean, glass-walled startup office, but a cramped, humming box above a train station in the 1880s. It's hot. It smells like sweat, oil, and hot metal. On every wall, wires, dozens of them, snaking in and out like veins. In the center, a row of men and women sit at long wooden tables, their fingers dancing over keys and levers. Tap, 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 tap. Metal arms click. Paper tape shivers. Little dots and dashes march across the line. This is a Western Union telegraph office. This is your first internet cafe. Messages arrive from Chicago, Boston, San Francisco. Prices, news orders, love letters, threats, gossip. All translated into a code that only a trained operator can read, then written down, handed to a runner, sent on its way. If you control these wires, if you decide which messages move first, which messages get lost, whose prices reach the market fastest, how much power do you really have? More than any social media platform on your phone. Now imagine stepping outside. A block away, a power station roars. Steam engines churn, driving dynamos that spit out electricity along thick cables. Lamps on the street flicker to life at dusk. Factories hum later into the night. Houses slowly trade candles for bulbs. For the first time in human history, darkness is no longer in charge of your schedule. Whoever owns that station decides who gets to see after sunset. We like to think tech started with Silicon Valley garages. It didn't. It started in rooms like these, where sound became dots and dashes, where coal became light, where distance started to shrink and time started to bend. And behind those rooms in quieter offices, there were men with ledgers and maps and very simple ambitions, not just to invent the future, to own it. Look up from that telegraph room to a very different space, a New York office lined with wood paneling, heavy curtains, and oil paintings. J.P. Morgan sits behind a desk that could double as a dining table. On it, papers, stock certificates, letters from inventors, offers from railroads. Outside, you can hear the clatter of carriages on cobblestones. Morgan doesn't build telegraphs. He buys them. He doesn't design light bulbs. He funds the companies that will light entire cities, and then merges, strangles, and reshapes them until they fit his idea of what a stable market should look like. Railroad barons use telegraph lines to coordinate trains, move troops, predict prices before their rivals. Telegraph companies piggyback on railroad right-of-ways to stretch their wires across the continent. Network on top of network. Sound familiar? New York, Boston, Pittsburgh. Workshops filled with prototypes. Labs cluttered with coils and glass tubes. Patent offices in which ink is still drying on diagrams of telephones, motors, relays, switches. Lawyers stepping over piles of documents, searching for a way to phrase a claim that will lock out competitors for years. These are your first tech hubs. No hoodies, no pitch decks. Just cigars, steel, and a lot of very sharp men who understand a simple truth. The first person to own the network makes the rules. Before Silicon Valley, the QWERTY keyboard, the light bulb, the telephone, and the power grid were already turning America into a machine. And the men behind them didn't just want to invent the future, they wanted to own it. Stay with me, because once you see how they fought for that ownership, today's big tech drama will start to look tame. Forget the friendly inventor in a dusty workshop. The dawn of American technology looked a lot more like a cartel war than a science fair. Patent trolls, smear campaigns, lobbyists, crushed rivals. If you think big tech is ruthless now, wait until you see how it started. Let's walk into one of the most famous battles, the War of the Currents. On one side, Thomas Edison, short, intense, trademark hair, already a celebrity. He's built his name on the phonograph, on improved telegraphy, on the incandescent bulb. But his real bet is a system, direct current, DC. On the other side, George Westinghouse. Tall, composed, already rich from air brakes and other industrial gear. He throws his weight behind an upstart genius, Nikola Tesla, with his alternating current, AC. To you today, AC versus DC might sound like a boring engineering debate. It wasn't. It was a fight over who would control electricity itself. Edison's DC system works, but only over short distances. You need a power station every few blocks. It's great if you own the station and the neighborhood contracts. Not so great if you're trying to light entire regions. Tesla's AC, backed by Westinghouse, can travel much farther. It can step up and step down voltages. It's cheaper, more flexible, more scalable. Edison sees the threat. He doesn't say, a superior technology, I shall gracefully retire. He goes to war. He launches a PR campaign to convince the public that AC isn't just dangerous, it's demonic. Public demos are arranged. Animals, dogs, calves, even an elephant, are electrocuted with AC in front of crowds to show how deadly Westinghouse's system is. Newspapers lap it up. Pamphlets warn that AC wires will fall and kill your children in the street. Edison supports the development of a new execution method, the electric chair. Guess which system they choose to use on condemned prisoners? A C. Why? Because then he can say, look, AC is literally the execution current. We use it to kill people. Do you really want that in your walls? This is your first standards war. This is your first coordinated smear campaign. Technically, Edison is brilliant. Strategically, he's doing what any modern platform giant does when a rival shows up with a better protocol. Flood the zone with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Twist public opinion. Use the state's machinery, here, the death penalty, to frame your competitor as a threat. In the end, AC wins. Westinghouse and Tesla light the Chicago World's Fair, then the Niagara Falls Power Project. The world sees entire cities bathed in electric light, powered from miles away, and the argument is over. But look closely at how it ended. Westinghouse is financially strained. Tesla, whose patents were crucial, tears up his royalty agreement to save the company. J.P. Morgan and other financiers step in, consolidating companies, erasing names, merging innovation into what becomes General Electric. The technology survives. The people who made it possible, some become legends, some become footnotes, some die nearly broke. Ask yourself, in that story, who looks more like modern tech? The genius in the lab? Or the banker, the brand, the man who controls the pipes and the patents? Now shift scenes. It's March 1876. A lawyer walks into the U.S. Patent Office with papers in hand. Another man, elsewhere in the city, is preparing to file something almost identical. Alexander Graham Bell, Elisha Gray. Two men reaching for the same future. A device that can carry human voice along wires. The race to patent the telephone is not a gentle contest of ideas. It's a knife fight in slow motion. Bell's attorney arrives first that day. His application is recorded. Gray's is logged as a caveat a few hours later. Did someone inside show Bell's team hints of Gray's design? Did Bell's lawyer inspire changes that gave them an edge? Historians still argue. What's clear is this: Bell gets the patent. What follows are years of litigation. Rivals claim Bell stole ideas, that his patent is invalid, that others built working telephones first. Western Union, the telegraph giant, initially rejects Bell's offer to sell his patent, and then realizes its mistake and tries to crush him instead, backing competitors and challenging patents in court. Bell's company fights back with an army of lawyers. Suit after suit, injunction after injunction. Smaller inventors and firms simply cannot afford the fight. Some sell out, some fold, some disappear. By the 1880s, the Bell Telephone Company, later AT&T, controls phone service in entire regions. If you want to talk, you play by their rules. Pause there. Think about how often we repeat this pattern. A breakthrough, a swarm of competitors. Then slowly one or two giants buy, sue, or lobby their way into a position where they don't just sell a product, they own the infrastructure. And once they own the infrastructure, they can decide who gets to build on top of it. Sound a bit like app stores, search engines, social networks? You know the names: Edison, Bell, Westinghouse, maybe Hollerith. But you don't know what they did off the posters. how they bought politicians, rewrote laws, and used every dirty trick in the book to make sure the future belonged to them, not their rivals. Which brings us to a quieter figure, sitting in a government office, staring at a problem made of numbers rather than wires. Herman Hollerith. It's the late 1880s. The United States is growing fast. Every 10 years, the government is supposed to count its people, age, occupation, race, location. The 1880 census took almost a decade to fully process by hand. By the time the numbers were ready, the country had already changed. The system is breaking. Hollerith designs a solution. Punched cards. Information about each person is recorded as holes in a stiff card. Machines read these holes with electrical contacts. Instead of clerks and ink, you have circuits and counters. Data moves from paper to pattern. The 1890 census uses his tabulating machines. The time to process the data collapses. What once took nearly 10 years now takes a fraction of that. The government can see trends faster, adjust policies faster, tax and conscript and plan faster. Hollerith doesn't build a smartphone. He builds something far more foundational. The idea that you can turn people into data, run them through machines, and extract patterns at scale. This is the seed of modern computing. Later, his company will merge and morph into IBM. The same IBM that will, in the 20th century, provide tabulating systems to governments and corporations around the world. Think about that arc, from a census crisis to a global data giant. How often today do we hear that data is the new oil? Hollerith's punch cards were the first pipelines. They showed governments and businesses that if you can collect enough information about people and build the right machines to sort it, you gain a kind of power that wires and light alone can't give you. Pause and connect the dots. Telegraph wires carrying messages faster than any horse. Telephones carrying voices across states. Power lines carrying electricity into homes and factories. Tabulators turning human lives into data points. You're not looking at kindly inventors in lab coats. You're looking at the prototype for big tech. Ruthless, litigious, obsessed with controlling not just products, but the infrastructure everyone else depends on. And here's the hinge. Once you own the rails, whether they're made of steel, copper, fiber, or code, you don't just make money. You decide what normal looks like, who gets connected and who stays in the dark, whose voice travels and whose dies in the room, which risks get funded and which get starved. We tend to tell these stories as if they're inevitable. Of course, Edison had to go to war. Of course, Bell had to crush rivals. Of course, data had to be automated. But nothing about this was inevitable. These men made choices, aggressive, calculated, sometimes cruel choices. They didn't just build technology. They built the rules of the tech game itself. So the next time someone says, "This is just how innovation works," a few geniuses, a few lucky breaks, the market deciding, remember the telegraph office, the electrocutions, the patent fights, the punched cards, and ask yourself, who wrote those rules? And who today is still playing by them? By the time the smoke clears from those early tech wars, something strange is happening. The machines are winning, not in a sci-fi sense. No killer robots, no glowing red eyes in a quieter way. They're winning your hours, your habits, your sense of what a normal day looks like. Imagine a machinist in a factory in 1900. 10 years ago, his father worked with hand tools, muscle, and time. Each piece he produced was the visible result of skill. He could point to it and say, "I made that." Now the factory floor vibrates with belts, pulleys, and clattering machines. Steam engines or electric motors drive entire lines of equipment. The machinist's job is not to shape the metal with his own hands, but to feed and guide the machine that does it for him. He's faster. He produces more. But something intangible has shifted. The rhythm of work is set not by his body or the sun, but by the machine's speed. If it breaks, he waits. If it runs, he keeps up. When the factory switches from gaslight to electric bulbs, the day stretches. Overtime becomes possible. The line between day and night blurs. A foreman doesn't really care if he's tired. The lights are still on. The motor is still turning. The orders still need to ship. Ask him how he feels about progress, and the answer isn't simple. He likes going home and pulling a chain to light a lamp instead of striking matches. He likes that his children can read at night without breathing in smoke, but he also knows the machine never gets tired. He does. Now shift to a clerk. She sits in an office with a telegraph sounder chattering on a table in the corner. Every few minutes, a messenger boy bursts in with a fresh slip of paper. Commodity prices from Chicago, shipping news from New York, a banker's instructions from London. Before the wires, her boss made decisions on last week's information. Now he makes them on this morning's. Deals can be made or broken in hours. Panic can spread faster than any physical disaster. The first time the stock market lurches because of a rumor sent along the wires, you can almost feel the world realizing information is no longer local. If someone in another city hears bad news before you do and acts on it, you lose. We don't call it FOMO yet, but we've already built the nervous system that will make it possible. Think about how disorienting that must be. For thousands of years, distance protected you. If something terrible happened far away, you might never know, or by the time you did, it was over, and there was nothing to be done. Now bad news arrives almost in real time. So does good news, so do lies. How do you live in a world where every day, the horizon of your worry expands with the length of the wire? We think we invented information overload with smartphones. We didn't. We just shrunk the telegraph office into our pockets. Hook back in for a second. We talk about the information age as if it started with Wi-Fi. It started when news and money began moving faster than horses. And just like now, the people building the systems got rich, while everyone else tried to relearn how to live inside them. Now walk down a different street. A crew is stringing wires along wooden poles. Bystanders watch, squinting at the glass insulators catching the light. Some shake their heads, too ugly, too dangerous. Others stare with a kind of awe. They've heard rumors. Soon you'll be able to pick up a device and talk to someone in another city as if they were in the next room. The first telephone in a town isn't installed in a random house. It goes into the office of someone important, a factory owner, a banker, a politician, a railroad depot. Whoever gets it first suddenly has an edge. They can make deals faster, get warnings earlier, coordinate more smoothly. The phone is marketed as a marvel. It's also a filter. It decides whose voice is allowed to travel at the speed of wire and who still moves at the speed of feet. Inside a home lucky enough to get a line, the first phone is treated almost like an altar. It sits on a special table in a quiet corner, the family gathered around during important calls. At first, it's a luxury. Within a generation, it's a necessity, not just for business, but for emergencies, for family, for the feeling of being connected to the wider world. Do you see the pattern? Electric light starts as a spectacle at world fairs, a skyline suddenly glowing in the night. Then it becomes normal. Telephones start as a rich man's toy. Then they become infrastructure. Automation begins as a marvel of engineering. Then it's just the way things are done. Technology moves from the edge to the center, from optional gadget to silent assumption. The invisible line is this. The moment you can't opt out without becoming poor, isolated, or uninformed, the tech is no longer just a product. It's a gate. And whoever guards it isn't just a businessman. He's a kind of unelected governor. Pause and ask yourself, at what point did you personally stop having a real choice about owning a smartphone, an email address, or a bank card? There's your line. Now go back a century to when electricity, telegraphs, telephones, and data machines crossed that same threshold. From that moment on, this wasn't just a story about innovation. It was a story about control. And once you see that, Act 4 writes itself. Because nothing we complain about in 2025 is new. Patent wars then, antitrust battles now, standards fights then, platform fights now, fears of monopoly then, fears of monopoly now. Change the clothes and the vocabulary, and today's hearings in Congress could be reruns of 1910. Same fear, a few companies controlling the wires the whole country depends on. Same question, who's really in charge? The elected government or the unelected tech barons? Think about Western Union in its prime. If you wanted to send a telegram across states, you used their network. Full stop. They were the default. They controlled pricing, routing, sometimes even content. During strikes or wars, governments leaned on them, censored messages, demanded access. Today we call that net neutrality, content moderation, state requests. Back then it was just business and politics. Then think about AT&T. By the early 20th century, it has swallowed smaller companies, signed exclusive deals, and positioned itself as the phone company. Its slogan might as well have been, "You don't like it? Don't call anyone." Decades later, the U.S. government will break it up under antitrust law, arguing that no single company should control an entire nation's voice. Does that sound familiar when you hear people arguing about whether one company should control search or mobile operating systems or social media? Or when regulators wonder if a handful of firms owning the majority of cloud computing capacity is, maybe, a problem? Look at the playbook the first tech giants wrote: secure patents, buy competitors. If you can't buy them, sue them. If you can't sue them into submission, lobby lawmakers to create rules that favor your infrastructure. Then say you're simply giving people what they want. And we believed it. We still do in many ways. That's the uncomfortable part. We love the story of the lone genius. We're less interested in the story of the boardroom where men decide in quiet voices whether to crush or buy the genius's company. We cheer when a new technology arrives. We rarely ask, who owns the rails under this? What happens if they decide to change the terms? The original network effect wasn't social media. It was the realization that the more people used one telegraph network, one phone network, one electric standard, the harder it became for any rival to break in. Your friends are all on Bell's system, so you join Bell. Your town is wired for AC, so DC is dead. Your census is built on Hollerith's cards, so future data systems will look like Hollerith's cards. Today, your friends are all on one messaging app, one social network, one video platform. So you join or you vanish from the conversation. The logic is the same, and so is the danger. Because once a network becomes the default, the choices of its owners become de facto laws for everyone plugged into it. If AT&T decides to raise rates, entire businesses feel it. If a platform today decides to tweak its algorithm, entire industries shake. If a cloud provider changes terms, entire startups scramble. We act shocked every time. We shouldn't be. The DNA for this dynamic was written when wires first crossed continents and lights first lit cities. So where does that leave you? Somewhere between admiration and unease. Admiration, because there's no denying the scale of what these first tech giants built. They really did help drag the world into a new era. Unease, because they also showed very clearly how easily innovation can slide into domination. And here's the hinge I want you to hold on to. The point isn't to worship the first tech giants or to demonize them. It's to recognize the pattern so the next time someone tells you a new technology will change everything, you know how to ask, for whom? Controlled by who? At what cost? If this story is making you look at your phone a little differently, good. That means you're starting to see the wires behind the screen. And once you see those wires, you're a little bit harder to quietly plug into someone else's empire. If you strip away the wires, the smoke, and the sepia tint, what are you really left with? A handful of men who looked at a world lit by candles and carried by horses and decided that wasn't enough. They weren't saints. They weren't cartoon villains. They were something far more dangerous, people who understood that if you could control the tools everyone else had to use, you didn't just make money, you made reality. Look back at where we've walked. A telegraph office that turned thoughts into dots and dashes, power stations that tamed the night, telephones that collapsed distance, tabulators that turned people into punch card patterns. Behind each of those shifts, a face, a name, a signature on a patent, a hand shaking a politician's hand just a little too firmly. How different does your own world look when you realize you're not the first generation to live inside someone else's infrastructure? If that realization stings a little, good. It means your brain is waking up from the inevitable progress story it's been fed. You've been told that tech is a straight line. Genius, arrow innovation, arrow products, arrow better world. What we've really seen is a loop: discovery, adoption, dependence, consolidation, backlash, repeat. Every time a new technology shows up, the same questions follow, even if we dress them in more polite language. Who gets it first? Who owns the rails underneath it? Who gets left behind when it becomes non-negotiable? And who, when the dust settles, gets to write the story that makes it all sound heroic? If this is the kind of lens you want on your history, not the postcard, but the X-ray, make sure you're subscribed. Because these are the questions that don't get asked in the highlight reels. Now zoom back in. Picture Edison staring at a filament glowing in a glass bulb. Picture Bell, hand shaking as he speaks into a crude receiver for the first time. Picture Hollerith punching holes into a card, knowing that if this works, the government will see its people in a completely new way, not as faces, but as fields in a table. Did they see you when they did that? Number. They saw problems and opportunities in their time. The shockwave just took a century to fully hit you. Right now, another set of people are sitting in labs and boardrooms, eyes lit by screens instead of gaslight, asking themselves how to use AI, biotech, quantum computing, or whatever comes next to solve a problem or capture a market. To them, you're not fully real either. You're a user, a data set, a demographic, a risk, a number on a slide that has to go up and to the right. Have you noticed how similar the language is? Connecting the world, empowering people, democratizing access. The vocab is softer, the logic is not. The first tech giants built wires and grids. Today's giants build feeds and clouds. But the core ambition is familiar, to become the system everyone else must use. Once you see that, the mystique starts to crack. A founder isn't a god. He's just a man with a lever, and your life happens to be on the end of it. The question is no longer, are they good or bad? The question is, what guardrails exist between their ambition and our lives? If you want more episodes that strip away the PR and put those levers under a spotlight, hit subscribe now, then come straight back to the story. Because here's the hardest part to swallow. We helped build every empire we're stuck inside. 19th century workers lined up for telephones, light, and factory jobs. They bought tickets, paid bills, filled out census forms. They didn't have the luxury of opting out without falling behind. You do the same thing today. You sign the terms of service. You click accept all cookies. You link your credit card. You train recommendation engines for free every time you scroll. We're not just victims of the system. We're participants, and that's exactly why we have more power than we think. If we know where to apply pressure. Where is that? Not in pretending we're going to throw our phones in a river and live in the woods. That's a fantasy. Power is in knowing the pattern well enough that you can vote with more than vibes when tech regulation shows up on the ballot. Support antitrust pushes not because you hate big business, but because you understand what happens when any one company holds the rails. Teach your kids that the story of tech is not genius princes of progress, but messy, contested ground where people got hurt and others got rich, and where they get to decide which side they're on. And above all, power is in refusing to let anyone tell you this is just how it has to be. Because it wasn't just how it had to be when Edison campaigned to make AC look like murder. It wasn't just how it had to be when Bell's lawyers buried competitors in paperwork. It wasn't just how it had to be when Hollerith's data machines turned people into patterns without asking if they wanted to be patterns. Those were choices. Our generation gets choices too. If you want company while you figure out what those choices look like, grounded in history, not hype, subscribing here is one of the simplest moves you can make. One click, and you don't have to rely on the algorithm to accidentally feed you stories that actually matter. Let's flip this whole thing on its head for a second. What if you treated history like a piece of infrastructure? Not something you visit occasionally when you're bored, but something you wire into your worldview so deeply that every press release, every revolutionary product, every new billionaire gets run through it before you decide how you feel. Someone announces a new AI that will change everything. You remember the first tabulators and ask, whose power will this speed up? A company wants to own the cables at the bottom of the ocean and the cloud and the platform on your phone? You remember Western Union and AT&T and ask, what happens if we let one entity own the whole stack? Politicians suddenly discover that tech might be a problem and promise hearings. You remember the first antitrust fights and ask, are they actually willing to break something apart, or is this just theater? History doesn't predict the future, but it does something just as valuable. It makes you harder to trick. If that's the kind of armor you want to build, one episode at a time, then seriously subscribe. That's what we're doing here. Not nostalgia, not fun facts, weapons. Now, one last thing. We started this story in cramped rooms of wires and steam. We ended in a quiet moment, with you looking at whatever screen you're on right now. Behind that screen is a power grid. Behind that grid is a web of standards and patents and deals cut more than a century ago. Behind the apps you use are platforms designed with someone else's goals in mind. You live at the far end of a chain that started when a few men in smoky rooms decided to wrap the world in copper, light, and data. You didn't choose that, but you get to choose what you do with the knowledge. Do you keep treating tech like magic handed down from geniuses? Or do you start seeing it as infrastructure built by people with motives, flaws, and limits, and start demanding that it serve more than just their balance sheets? Do you keep eating the myth whole, or do you start biting back? That's the real question this story leaves you with. Not was Edison a good guy? Not who invented what first? But how will I live, vote, teach, and build in a world where I finally see the wires? If you're ready to keep pulling on those wires with us through oil booms, financial panics, propaganda machines, and every other innovation that quietly reprogrammed how people live, hit subscribe, drop a comment about which story you want us to dissect next, and then look up from your screen. Look at the cables in your wall, the towers on your horizon, the clouds in your terms of service. And remember, the first tech giants showed us that whoever owns the network shapes the world. The next chapter is about whether we let that stay true, or finally decide that the world belongs to more than a handful of men in cleverly lit rooms.